So as I said, my name's Catherine and I'm the manager of the Tyfu Cymru project. We are a 5-year policy and research project funded by Oak Foundation and based within the membership body for housing professionals, the Chartered Institute of Housing. This is the third of 3 webinars hosted by Tyfu Cymru. At the start of July, we launched our recent report into the experiences of local government housing professionals throughout 2020. Finding that for many, they've been able to embrace new ways of working, have delivered on Welsh Government pledges to provide accommodation to homeless people, but that they are really feeling the strain of new responsibilities on top of the day job. Last week, we were discussing the findings of our report into hospital discharges, reflecting the need for more consistent practices of ensuring housing knowledge as part of the discussions with patients when planning their return from hospital. Again, COVID has put a huge strain on the process, with some useful lessons that really need to be borne attention to. Both these reports and our other work are on our website, and we're really willing to talk more to anyone who's interested in our work, in the reports that you see up on the screen or in the discussion that we have today. Do get in touch with us. Let us know if you'd like to know more. We're very happy to do presentations to your tenants, to your staff, to your senior leadership teams, anything really to keep the discussion going about what we found as experiences of housing and housing professionals. So we're really looking forward to today's presentation, knowing the important role that the private rented sector plays in housing in Wales. We're really pleased. We've got such an excellent array of speakers. First up, we've got Jane Pennell presenting on the Welsh Government support that has been made available to tenants and landlords in the private rented sector. Then we've got Dr. Jennifer Harris, who'll be discussing a recent publication with the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Excellent Evidence on innovations in housing advice to the private rented sector. And then we've got Emily Samuel from Pobl Letting Agency, who'll be giving us a flavour of the realities of letting homes during a pandemic. There's time at the end for questions and answers, and we really encourage you to come and ask us questions, tell us about your experiences within this particular area. And if you'd like to come on the stage, just raise your hand, and then you can turn on your camera and your microphone when we call you to the stage, and share your questions and your experiences. I'm going to briefly touch on some work conducted by Tyfu Cymru in 2018 in our report, Private Renting and Mental Health, A Way Forward. We worked with TyPow to speak to over 100 landlords and over 100 support organisations to understand the issues for people. We asked a range of questions relating to the support that tenants and landlords felt they had received from services and to understand what that meant for people. We wanted to find out the extent to which landlords and tenants are able to get the support when they needed it and how they needed it. We know that having the right information and support can make all the difference for tenants in the private rented sector who are experiencing mental health problems. But they told us that there is little understanding of housing needs in the private sector for people with mental health problems. 38% felt there was never enough support, 50% felt there was sometimes enough, and only 4% thought there was always enough support. The cost of this is that people who are not sure who to talk to if they're struggling with their mental health about the housing issues that they face. Our research found substantial gaps in information available to landlords and tenants in the PRS, that this information could be provided through membership and regulatory body for private sector and landlords. We felt that there really needs to be better support and information for landlords and tenants, but we also need to get a much better understanding of discrimination against people with mental health problems. After our report found that up to 90% of support organisations thought that this was an issue. And I think this is really important, that as we are coming to where we are, after the last year and a half living through the pandemic, we all know that there is concern around people's mental health and maintaining good mental health within the population. And so it feels that this is still a very timely and important piece of work that we should be understanding about how the experiences of people with mental health problems living in the private rented sector. We have been working alongside other organisations and with Welsh Government to embed our recommendations, and have seen progress with information being much more widely available for landlords and tenants. There's a dedicated module on Rent Smart Wales on how to support tenants experiencing mental distress, and there are policies being implemented to ensure that people who are experiencing a crisis don't lose their homes due to their landlords evicting them for non-payment of rent while they're having a stay in hospital. We've also seen more work on supporting tenants through support to TPAS to work with the private rented sector. But what we could not have foreseen at that moment was that the role of the COVID pandemic would have for so many tenants and landlords and for all of us. And that's why we're so pleased to be able to come today to kind of bring this topic to life. And so pleased so many of you have been able to join in with this discussion. I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Jane Purnell from Welsh Government. If you can come up to the screen, Jane.
Oh, apologies. Hi, thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks for inviting me along today. It's good to be here. Right, well, I'll make a start then. Thank you, Catherine. Bore da pawb, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank members of the Untitled Cymru project for inviting me here today. This is a fantastic opportunity for me to be able to tell you about the support that the Welsh Government's provided for the private rented sector throughout the pandemic. Next slide, please. I'll start by going back to 2019. I know Catherine has just mentioned now the fantastic report that was done by the Untitled Cymru project called Private Renting and Mental Health: The Way Forward. The former Minister for Housing and Local Government welcomed the findings of the report and asked my team to work closely with other teams in the Welsh Government and our external partner organisations to implement the recommendations of the report. One example of how organisations have collaborated to address the recommendations is the training that's been developed by Tai Pawb and Platform. The training helps to raise awareness of different mental health problems and equips landlords and managing agents with the tools to signpost tenants to help and support. This is a part of a suite of training that's delivered by Rent Smart Wales and helps landlords and managing agents to support their tenants. We've worked closely with colleagues in the Welsh Government Health Department to make sure that the Together for Mental Health delivery plan includes actions that relate to the private rented sector. We felt that this was important as there are strong links between housing and health that can make a significant contribution to improving mental health and wellbeing outcomes. Next slide, please. Moving forward to early last year, and who could have predicted that we'd be having a pandemic to navigate through? This has focused our minds even more on the need for everyone to have access to a safe and affordable home. Mental health problems have worsened across all age groups in the past year, as Catherine already mentioned. In adults, the population of individuals showing symptoms of depression has almost doubled since the start of the pandemic. So it's crucial to be able to signpost people to the help and support they need. Rent Smart Wales has the latest information on its website, which can help anyone in the private rented sector that's struggling with their mental health. The pandemic has also highlighted the huge challenges people face who don't have a permanent home. During the last year, we've supported well over 10,000 people into temporary accommodation, with the help and support of our partner organisations. My minister is clear that the investments made to date are not just a short-term fix, but the start of a transformation towards ending homelessness in Wales. Preventing homelessness can be complex, but our housing support grant has prevention at its core. It's designed to support people to live independently and help them maintain tenancies and prevent homelessness. The pandemic has brought particular challenges for the private rented sector. Some tenants have been placed on furlough schemes, some have had to stay at home to look after family members and loved ones, some have had to self-isolate, and others have found themselves perhaps for the first time without a job. These are indeed really difficult times. We always encourage tenants to pay their rent or speak to their landlords or managing agents at the earliest opportunity if they're struggling to do so. As soon as we were aware of the difficulties that tenants were facing, we provided extra funding to Citizens Advice Company to establish a free private sector debt helpline. Tenants can speak to independent trained advisors who can help them to maximise their income, support them to claim benefits that they are entitled to, and undertake an assessment of affordability. Advisors can help with affordable rent reduction plans and rent arrears repayment plans, which the tenant can use to negotiate with their landlord or managing agent. Further support is now in place for those who are in debt with the introduction of the breathing space regulations, which came into force on the 4th of May this year. This gives people in debt 60 days breathing space or a longer period if a debtor is determined to be in mental health crisis, whereby the creditor must not take any enforcement action or charge any interest or fees or penalties on the debt whilst the debtor seeks advice and assistance. For further information about this change in the law, you can contact Citizens Advice Company. Throughout the pandemic, we've taken unprecedented action to protect public health and support Welsh tenants. In December, we introduced the emergency public health regulations that prevent individuals from being evicted in most circumstances. Separately, we've increased the notice period for evictions in almost all cases to 6 months. There is a range of support available to those who are threatened with homelessness, and we would urge anyone who has been served with an eviction notice to immediately contact their local authority housing team. We continue to provide additional funding to local authorities to ensure everyone is able to access appropriate temporary accommodation in order to stay safe. Next slide, please. We've also increased the funding for discretionary housing payments, which help tenants in receipt of housing benefits or universal credit to help out with their housing costs. Only last year, we introduced the Tenancy Save a Loan scheme, which was established to help tenants if they have problems paying their rent due to any change in circumstances because of COVID-19. Low interest loans were granted by credit unions, which are based on the amount of rent arrears owed and the affordability of a loan repayment. The good news is, and I should know because I'm currently working on this, that the Minister has recently announced that the loans will be replaced by grants with the introduction of the Tenancy Hardship grant. The grant scheme, which will be administered by local authorities, is designed to support people who've fallen behind on their rent by more than 8 weeks between the 1st of March 2020 and the 30th of June 2021. The scheme hasn't opened just yet, but tenants can register their interest if they're eligible. Applications will be open around about mid-July. So if anybody needs any information, there's information on the Welsh Government website, and you can register an interest with your local authority. We continue to fund organisations such as Shelter Cymru and Citizens Advice Cymru so that they can continue to provide help and support for the private rented sector. Information about the support that's available can be found on the COVID-19 housing pages of the Welsh Government website. We also work closely with Rent Smart Wales and have asked the team there to communicate key messages from the Welsh Government throughout the pandemic. This is done using social media, newsletters, and regular updates on the website. Following the recent Senedd elections, we were fortunate enough to have Julie James as our Minister for another term of government. She's now the Minister for Climate Change, and her portfolio has brought together the environment, energy, housing and regeneration, planning and transport. This is indeed a really huge remit, but we're really glad that we've got Julie one more time because she understands the issues that are happening across the private rented sector in Wales. The programme for government has been published, and there's lots for us in the housing department to focus on during this Senedd term. Housing is one of the key areas in the Race Equality Action Plan for Wales, for example. More than half of the tenants in the private rented sector come from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. It's important that we listen and work with ethnic community groups community mentors and people with lived experience to tackle racism and discrimination across the sector. I know Catherine mentioned discrimination early on, and that goes across the board. So that's something that we're looking to focus on during this term of the Senedd election. The Race Equality Action Plan is currently out for public consultation, and this will end on the 15th of July. I'd encourage everyone to respond to the consultation so that we have your views about the plan. This will help to inform possible changes that we'll make across the private rented sector in Wales. We will continue to address the barriers tenants face in both accessing and staying in private rented accommodation. One initiative that will help us to do this is the National Leasing Scheme for Wales. The scheme is currently running as a pathfinder across 7 local authorities. They are Carmarthenshire, Cardiff, Conwy, Denbighshire, Ceredigion, Newport and Rhondda Cynon Taf. For those struggling financially, the disparity between local housing allowance rates and market rent limits access to the private rented sector. Working collaboratively with external stakeholders, we've developed a model that we believe will give local authorities a significant extra resource in helping to prevent and relieve homelessness. Finding an offer that also works for landlords has been an important part of developing this model. The Pathfinder has improved access to affordable and good quality homes in the PRS for those in receipt of benefits, including universal credit, through the removal or reduction of risks which property owners may perceive as arising during a tenancy. It provides longer-term security of accommodation for tenants at risk of homelessness by providing accommodation for a period of up to 5 years and tailored and regular support to help tenants maintain their tenancy during the scheme and in the future. Properties in the scheme are brought up to an agreed minimum standard with the help of financial assistance from the Welsh Government. The Minister for Climate Change has agreed in principle for officials to continue to explore and develop the leasing scheme for Wales with local authorities and other key stakeholders. Next slide, please. Right, you'll see from this one I've asked, how can the private rented sector help the Welsh Government? You may be wondering why I've asked this question. Well, it's quite straightforward. To be honest with you, we need your help in understanding what's going on across the sector, and we need your experiences to help us make the necessary changes to make improvements as well. There are lots of ways you can do this. You can share your experiences with our partner organisations. So, for example, I've already mentioned Citizens Advice, Shelter Cymru, and Rent Smart Wales, just to name, a few. You can become a member of Tenant Pulse, which is hosted by TPAS Cymru. They hold regular meetings and conduct surveys to seek the views of both tenants and landlords across the sector. And finally, I would encourage everyone to take part in Welsh Government public consultations. This is an excellent way for us in the Welsh Government to seek your views about the things that matter to you, that affect your lives. Next slide, please. I just want to say thank you for your time today. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to let you know about some of the things we've been doing to make a difference to the private rented sector in Wales during the pandemic. I hope you found this helpful, and I'm available to take questions following the next presentations. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jane. It was really, really useful. It was really good to hear the perspective from Welsh Government, and we're really grateful that you came and spent the time with us. Our next presentation is from Dr. Jennifer Harris. So if you could come up onto the stage, Jennifer. And as mentioned, you can put the questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we'll come to the questions and answers at the end. But over to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint slides up a moment. So I lead on a UK-wide research programme, which is called Raising Standards in the UK Private Rented Sector. We carry out a range of different projects with a broad objective of improving conditions and outcomes in the sector. I'm going to talk about some of the findings that emerged from one of our recent studies, which looked at innovations in advice. So the objective was quite broad. We wanted to look at examples of innovation, and today I'm going to talk about those examples, but also sort of focus on one particular theme that emerged throughout the course of the research, which is some of the challenges, developments, opportunities that are associated with shifting to remote advice, digital advice. Now, of course, as in any consumer market, renters need to be able to assert their legal rights. They need to be aware of their entitlements. They need to have options for resolving their problems sort of quickly when they do occur. However, we know that sort of all too often renters face difficult and convoluted advice journeys. Indeed, both landlords and tenants face significant barriers to accessing advice. There's been a lot of changes over the last 10 years, sort of significant cuts to legal aid budgets that have had quite a drastic effect on the availability of face-to-face advice. Now in Wales, sort of these cuts were not quite as severe in England. There was sort of some additional funding made available by the Welsh Government, but what we do know is that across the UK, demand often surpasses supply, and due to capacity constraints, services often struggle to respond to all the requests they receive. Now, the introduction of social distancing has inevitably changed the mechanisms of advice delivery. Prior to COVID, much of the advice sector would offer in-person advice or telephone-based advice, sort of based at office premises. Now they face the challenge of adjusting their practices and using technology in sort of creative ways to provide advice remotely. But this is occurring within the context of sort of those kind of sort of pressures that the sector is already experiencing that I've just mentioned. That being said, sort of the shift to remote advice is not a new phenomenon. So there's organisations such as Shelter and Citizens Advice that have offered advice and information, housing advice and information through an array of different channels, and have done so for quite some time. We see sort of in the past 10 years sort of increased focus on behalf of governments in terms of sort of political preferences and funding allocations, sort of focusing more on the provision of remote advice. That being said, we don't have much information about sort of the successes, the opportunities, the challenges of providing advice in sort of different ways. And sort of one important point I would say in terms of the background is innovating in channel choice and thinking about how to provide advice remotely does involve us perhaps sort of challenging common assumptions about how people will or won't use technology. So there's quite a lot of research out there that shows that sort of what we think are common sense assumptions about sort of digital exclusion or digital proficiency don't always recognize the diverse and complex ways in which people use technology. So, for example, there's an assumption that sort of young people occupy the positive side of the digital divide. You know, the digital savvy, well able and willing to use technology. But there has been research which has shown that young people can be the group that struggle the most to access advice, legal advice online. So it depends on sort of what technology is being used for. It depends on key contextual factors as well that affect people's engagement with advice, not just their skills, the support they have, the equipment, but also sort of the wider sort of circumstances of their lives in which they are searching for advice and in which they're using technology. So one thing I would like to see more of is more thought to given is how is the specific circumstance of living in the PRS, how would that affect people's ability to use remote advice, you know, in terms of the perpetual insecurity that many people feel, which, you know, has come out quite strongly in another project that we're just wrapping up now on well-being, or in terms of sort of power inequalities, or in terms of when people are afraid of losing their homes. How does that shape people's experience of being able to use different channels? And that's something we don't know a lot about, and I would like to see further research on that topic. But just today I'm going to talk about sort of some of the findings that emerged from some case studies I did with 6 different services from across the UK. We interviewed staff and a few clients, and we reviewed sort of a legal needs literature. So there's quite a lot of sort of principles and lessons from the past 10 years that can be transferred to our current thinking about the future landscape of advice provision. So the first case study we looked at was an advice bot which had been developed. Now, under COVID, services have reported that there's a need to manage to increase the demand from what they're calling like a new cohort of advice seekers. So people that are perhaps experiencing civil legal problems for the very first time, they need to access advice services. And this group is assumed to be more IT literate and therefore more able to access services online, not exclusively, but one thing that did come out of in our studies is the clear potential to improve technological interfaces, to improve the use of technology for that very first stage of when people go and look for advice and information. So this was a Citizens Advice Bureau based in England that tried to do just that. It's something like this. It's relatively in its infancy across the UK. It's used more widely sort of for civil legal advice internationally, but it's just sort of being developed within a UK context. And there's different options. Initially they wanted to have an option where people could just put in free text. They could just type in what their problem was, and that more closely sort of mirrors the human experiences, mirrors human interaction. But that's quite difficult because of problems around legal capability. So often when people have a legal housing problem, they don't know the different dimensions or the different aspects of it, which are important to achieving sort of a speedy and successful resolution. So how is that bit of technology supposed to interpret that when the person that's putting the information in the first place doesn't quite know what to put in, and they're just countered with this great big wall of text? So they kind of sort of scaled back their expectations. They thought that's not quite working, and they reverted to sort of more of a binary model. So it's a piece of technology that can answer like yes, no, are you a private sector tenant? Just kind of quite simple queries, and it can signpost people to different parts of the website. And what that does as well is it collates information that would usually be asked at the start of the advice session, so that a certain amount of information would be already available. Because if we can kind of sort of channel out those people that are successfully able to self-help, that are successfully able to use online information, that frees up resources for those people that really do need that more sort of in-person and perhaps face-to-face support. Now, but the key learning that came out of this case study was that really we need to, when we're thinking about developing technology for advice, for housing advice, for advice in the private rented sector, we need to be really realistic about who it will work for. So initially this service thought it can work for everybody, and then they kind of again scaled back their expectations, and they said we need to come at it with sort of a different assumptions, because again I think sometimes that's where we can go wrong with digital platforms. They can be underpinned by this assumption that everybody can use it, and then kind of the usual journey or the usual experience can kind of be it's a bit of an afterthought rather than something that's kind of really embedded within the design process. So if we're really embedding sort of a user-focused approach and what people's experiences, needs, circumstances, skills, preferences, and really tailoring different channels, what it means we do need different channels, then one's not going to be appropriate. So that's what they learned. They said we need to make it more focused and targeted. Now, the second case study that we looked at was a sustainment service, a PRS sustainment service that was based in Scotland. And this was commissioned by a local authority, and it emerged from sort of an ambition, an aim to support people living in the PRS avoid homelessness. They noticed that there was a large percentage of people living in temporary accommodation that were becoming homeless from the PRS, and they identified high levels of sort of rent arrears and tenancy non-sustainment, but among families that had sort of complex and diverse support needs. So actually the rent arrears were just the tip of the iceberg. So with this service, success sort of depended on the advice and cooperation that existed between different partners. So the first month of the service was dedicated sort of exclusively to establishing sort of information and referral pathways. And it's not an advice service, but it's part of the wider sort of advice and support ecosystem that that really needs to be available for people living in the sector. And that's one thing that's struck me quite strongly since I've been working on this research program, is that actually there needs to be significant improvements if in the advice and support ecosystem, if the PRS is going to successfully meet the challenges which are being placed upon it, because there is an increasing number of people living in the sector that perhaps previously would have been able to access social housing, people that perhaps do need a bit of advice and support in order to sustain the tenancies, in order to meet the different sort of needs that they might have. So I would like to see a lot more of these kind of services developed as part of that ecosystem. And during COVID, this service did continue to work remotely, but it actually found maintaining engagement and communication quite challenging. And they found some solutions to that. They did socially distanced visits in the park and stuff like that. But actually, the challenges that they faced, to me, what it illustrates is the importance of human interactions in supporting people to adapt to the channel shift. So they raised some funding so that people could be supplied with iPads or laptops, during the pandemic. But they really did need to provide quite intensive in-person support, again, sort of socially distanced support to help people sort of use these new technologies. And it also raises questions for me to the extent to which relationship-based approaches that are needed for when people have more complex lives can be established and maintained remotely, and how are people's experiences of trying to access advice remotely situated within their experiences of trying to meet the basic needs, because this services was really supporting people that was experiencing quite severe destitution. They were quite severely marginalized. So it's thinking about how that context would influence people's ability to use systems, not just the IT skills. So, and again, this quote just emphasizes the importance of building relationships to this particular service. And I would just emphasize that this is not something that is appropriate or indeed needed for, a majority or a large number of people living within the sector. It is resource intensive. But it's needed for kind of, I would say, a small minority of people who living in the sector who face significant barriers in accessing mainstream services, and they need somebody to kind of help them navigate them. And for people that are familiar with the housing first approach, it draws on some of the support principles in terms of kind of establishing a trusting relationship with one key worker over a period of time, and it's non-time limited and that sort of thing. So that was the second case study. Now the third case study we looked at was a peer-led housing advice scheme that was based in Northern Ireland. So these were peer advisors that were trained and recruited from the local community in order to provide advice for different language groups. And this service met the challenge of providing advice during COVID by exploring sort of what are the different channels, support networks, community infrastructures that are open to people, and how do we tailor support accordingly? And this sort of ties back to my earlier point, where it's like, how do we tailor sort of remote or different channels of advice provision to the needs and circumstances of different groups, rather than having this kind of one size fits all approach, which has, in some parts of the UK has been pursued in the past and has not been particularly successful. If you look at some of like the outcomes around the mandatory telephone gateway and so forth, for those of you that are familiar with that. But anyway, so this service noticed that the Syrian community, for example, when they get settled in Northern Ireland, they spend a week in a settlement program, and as part of that, they get set up with an email address and a WhatsApp address, a WhatsApp account, and they realised they weren't getting any contacts from the Syrian community. But when he set up a WhatsApp account, they became flooding through. So they realised that was the ideal channel for that particular group. And then where members of the communities were identified as vulnerable or digitally excluded, they would establish connections with sort of key respected individuals who were known in the community, who could kind of refer people in, who could communicate community needs to the service. They could address access barriers by making community visits on behalf of the service. So this is really interesting, because it raises questions on how do we draw on the capacity and the capability of a wider diversity of actors of different voluntary services to improve standards in the private rented sectors. So lots of we know traditionally people don't necessarily seek advice they don't necessarily go to traditional advice agencies. They're more likely to perhaps go to, in some circumstances, to go to kind of community services. So how do we harness that knowledge, that skills? How do we establish two-way information flows, and how can technology be used to support those two-way information flows? Which leads me on quite nicely to my next example, which we looked at as sort of the more that there's like a national advice strategy which has been developed recently in Wales. It aims to simplify the advice journey with advice provision sort of divided over 6 different regions each region works in partnerships with a range of advice, sort of traditional advice organizations and then non-advice organizations to deliver services that respond to local priorities. And it was quite interesting when I looked at this example. I know it's still early days. I mean, some of the initial evaluation results have been quite positive. They have obviously faced some challenges in establishing and building the necessary partnerships under COVID. But in some of the principles upon which this sort of initiative is based really does reflect on some of the best, what legal needs literature, what existing research and evidence says is best practice in providing legal needs advice. And one of those things is that because people, when they experience sort of housing problems with the PRS tenancies, it's very rarely just a housing problem. Anyone that provides advice will be familiar with the idea of sort of the clustering of legal issues or the overlapping nature of people's issues. There might be an employment issue as well as a housing issue, as well as a debt problem, perhaps a mental health problem. And so, in order to respond to these overlapping needs, we need to bring in a diversity of organizations that are not just legal advice services. So this is partly what this sort of initiative is trying to do. And one of the things in terms of technology that makes this quite innovative is the adoption of something that's called ReferNet. So usually when referrals are made between different organizations, it happens through emails, it happens through calls, it happens through service visits. What that can result in is delays, it can, work being duplicated, and people falling between different services, or people disengaging altogether because they're being circulated around different services. So by sort of digitalizing the process, it can help to formalize and standardize information flows so they can track clients between different services, and that should hopefully lead to an improved advice journey for client. There's also a sort of a national telephone advice service that functions alongside the regional networks, and something I thought was quite interesting was that the regional networks are encouraged to adopt a multi-channel approach, which is on the basis of user research is made relevant and appropriate for people in these communities. So again, we have sort of something that's responsive to sort of different people's needs and circumstances, rather than having this one size fits all approach. And if anyone here is familiar with advice, sort of how the advice sector has kind of changed and developed in England over the last 10 years, you would appreciate why I keep sort of reiterating that point. And then the final sort of key learning that I think from this initiative is this idea that there's important place related factors that contribute to how effective advice is. So there has been sort of prior and during the pandemic in different parts of the UK, there have been sort of national remote advisory service being developed, but we need to think about sort of that sort of people don't only have their own personal needs, but they live within different areas, within different geographical boundaries. Now each of these different areas has a mix of different services, voluntary services, advice services, legal services, whatever it might be. So knowledge of services operating in that area is sort of is something that could potentially be lost in the development of national remote services if they operated exclusively. This is trying to do something a little bit different. It's trying to link that national service with the remote offices so they can be referred in both ways. Now, I won't talk about, there was a tenancy relation officer service in London, which I don't really have time to talk about. That was quite interesting in terms of how voluntary organisations are working with local authorities in order to support people living in the PRS who face sort of illegal eviction and harassments, and kind of these novel arrangements and novel partnerships is something. Tenancy relations obviously is not a new service, but the way in which it is operated, the way in which it's been provided by a voluntary service is quite interesting. I'll just quickly finish up with a couple of quick learnings, and I mean these points. There's tons of learning that we can draw from the report, and I'll ask Catherine to circulate that after the event. But just in terms of in relation to remote services, that's kind of been one of the key themes I've talked about today. So the remote services will go some way to meeting existing needs, but some groups will always require some level of face-to-face support. Again, that sounds like an obvious point, but I think it's important to keep reiterating that. And again, we're developing different channels and forms of advice provision. They need to be evidence-based rather than assumptions made on advance about who can and can't use technology. And then, clear understanding of the communication channels that different groups are willing and able to use needs to, again, inform how we develop services during COVID and as we emerge out of the pandemic. And I would say sort of developing a effective multi-channel approach, which myself and other people working in this field would advocate quite strongly is what's needed, is a multi-channel approach, is that we need to look at strengthening all channels of advice provision for renters, for other people needing and landlords, of course, as well, and other people needing civil legal advice, rather than just looking at remote channels. So that's me done.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really interesting, and it's always so useful to hear about experiences from other projects, other areas, that we can apply to our own work, that we can also make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel every time. So thank you very much for that. Do you want to unshare your screen? That's fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. And as I say, there's lots of time question and answers at the end. Our final speaker today is Emily Samuel from Pobble Letting Agency, who's going to be talking a bit about the realities of letting houses and homes during the pandemic. So over to you, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to run through just quickly with you some of the reflections of this very strange sort of past 16 months and share my experience of the effects we've seen the pandemic have on the landlords that we work with and the realities of letting homes during this time. And the first thing probably to mention is that we're still working remotely at home, which has proved challenging at times. As a letting agency, my team are used to being in the same room, problem sharing, bouncing off each other. And all of a sudden, like many others, we were forced to dramatically change the way that we work. We had to quickly adapt our processes to ensure the high level of service we give our customers had not been compromised. I think one of the biggest challenges, which has actually on reflection been really positive, is that we've taken a much more digital first approach. We've moved our tenancy sign-in over to e-sign, carried out virtual valuations, virtual viewings, remote inspections, and that's all really helping with our journey and our ambitions to also become carbon neutral as an organisation. So what will my landlords tell you about this past year? I think that they'd share that, yeah, there's been some rent arrears and they've increased, which is probably no surprise. But interestingly, on the whole, the tenants that were already in arrears are the cases that have increased. We haven't seen a high volume of new cases, which is great, but we've seen the current cases rocketing. Now, I can't speak for the whole sector, but for the properties that we manage, this has certainly been the case. Which leads me to share some of our experience about the tenant saver loan, which Jane mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, we didn't have many tenants that were able to benefit from the scheme. And whilst I think it was a great idea, I don't know that in reality it did as much as it was set out to do. As I've mentioned, we found the majority of the arrear cases, our tenants were already in arrears prior to the pandemic, but since the pandemic, the arrears had escalated to an unmanageable amount, and yet this demographic of tenants were excluded from the scheme. This was the same for our tenants in receipt of some form of housing benefits, some sort of top-ups. They couldn't make use of the tenant saver loan, but we've seen some to really struggle to make their top-up payments to meet the rental amount with little support for that sort of demographic. One example, we had a tenant who was in around sort of £600 arrears prior to the pandemic. She was claiming a top-up with regard to her housing benefit. She also pays a top-up for her rent. Her arrears have over doubled. She's now £1,500 in arrears. Luckily, her landlord is really understanding and in a position that they can work with her, but that's not the case for everyone. Some of our landlords had arrear cases that were at the point they would normally be seeking back possession of the property with a court order that was already in the system prior to the pandemic. We saw the eviction ban prevent the possessions going ahead, which has resulted in the arrears continuing to grow, the tenant being unable to access the loan due to one of the reasons I've mentioned, and getting into really unmanageable debt. The landlord has a property where they're receiving no rent. They can't seek possession on the ground of serious arrears. However, had the property been in England, then that allowance would have been made. And whilst I completely understand Welsh Government's intentions to prevent evictions during the pandemic, we also have a zero eviction mindset at Pobble. However, I don't think enough support was considered to landlords, and in particular those who had tenants in arrears prior to the pandemic. The 6-month notice again has proved challenging to some landlords, and not just in arrears cases, where actually sometimes these notices can be an essential tool in saving and sustaining a tenancy. But we also had a landlord whose wife had sadly passed away, and he was unable to put the property up for sale because of the extension of the notice period at that time. We've noticed some of our landlords selling up and getting out altogether. We've seen a number of tenants move in, and at that point, the landlord taking the opportunity to sell. The eviction ban, the increased time in notices, changes in legislation have all proved too much. And this is a risk. I think it's a real risk that we lose these very much needed additional homes. There's a fine balance of making the private rented sector better, which I completely support, but not tipping that balance so far in favour of tenants that landlords just leave altogether. Property Mark's private rented sector report from last September showed an increase in the number of landlords selling their buy-to-let properties, with the figures for that September being the highest on record. Fundamentally, landlords can't be expected to provide homes without being paid. In many instances, rent covers the landlord's mortgages, maintenance costs, meaning non-payments can put the tenant at risk of eviction and the landlord at risk of repossession. So what has the impact on landlords been? Well, the National Residential Landlord Association ran a survey of its members in England and Wales online between the 5th of December last year and the 18th of January this year, which 1,391 landlords responded. It found that 60% had lost rental income as a result of the pandemic. 39% of those who had lost rental income said the losses were continuing to increase, and 34% said they were more likely to either leave the market completely or sell some of the properties they rent out. The vast majority of landlords are not millionaire property investors. 94% of the landlords surveyed rent property out as an individual. 45% rent just one property, and 44% became a landlord to contribute to their pension. Now, I would say that the properties we manage also reflect this. The majority of our landlords have got just one property, and many of them are accidental landlords. Tenant demand is unbelievably high right now, with a real shortage of properties available to let in the local rental market. The numbers of tenants registered on Rightmove is increasing, with the highest on record of tenants looking to move for the month of May. Now, this really highlights the booming rental market, but also the shortage of rental properties. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the demand for rental property, it soared, which we found really surprising. It also pushed rental values higher than we would have ever expected during a pandemic. And I can give you an example of this. We had a 3-bedroom property, a family home that we rented in Abergavenny prior to the pandemic. The property was advertised on Rightmove for about 3 weeks when we took an application. That same property has recently become available, and again, advertised in the same way on Rightmove for a slightly higher rent. We had 18 people interested in applying in just 2 days of it being advertised. People are willing to pay more to secure the right property. I think this is due to the lack of properties available. I think the amount of people working from home, realising they need to move for more space, and we've seen tenants' priorities have changed. Gardens have become more important than ever. So a future shortage of properties to rent will really affect tenants, making the supply short and the rents of those available higher. To round up, I would say, yes, the private rented sector has changed during and following COVID. Landlords have got phenomenal choice of tenant right now, which is a concern, as the tenants most in need could easily be overlooked. I think the government must recognise that the private rented sector has already been heavily impacted financially in recent years, based on the phasing out of tax relief on mortgage interest for landlords, the additional stamp duty land tax surcharge on buy-to-let property, and the tenant fee ban, with more to come when the Renting Homes Act is implemented. However, the ongoing repercussions of the pandemic mean that landlords' costs have increased significantly too, and many landlords can no longer make ends meet. The Tenancy Hardship Grant, which Jane introduced earlier, is a welcome step in supporting tenants in COVID-related rent arrears, and it will help to lighten the financial burden that landlords have faced during the pandemic, so long as it reaches far enough and some of the restrictions we saw with the Tenancy Saver loan are readdressed. It is vital we protect people that rent in the private rented sector, but also that we offer enough support to those landlords that provide the very much needed additional homes. To reduce the decline in buy-to-let landlords on the private rented sector, I think the government really needs to take a holistic approach that considers the financial implications of both the pandemic and existing costs that landlords face. So thank you. I hope that's given you an insight into some of the pressures that the private rented sector is currently facing and some of the challenges landlords have experienced during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a really interesting kind of insight into the experiences on the ground that's been happening within your agency and the landlords you work with, and indeed the tenants. If I can ask our three speakers to come up, put their cameras on, if that's okay, just so we can get the three of you up. Thank you so much. I think it's been a really, really interesting event. I've certainly learned a huge amount. We've had some questions in already, so I'll kickstart those. John Irving, would you like to put on your microphone and ask your question to Emily, or I can ask it for you?
Hello, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, John. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, so I've put a couple of questions in there, but interestingly, I'm a big supporter of the Homeless Reduction Act and early intervention. Unfortunately, a lot of local authorities are overwhelmed with approaches and the administration burden. And although we gained the extra 28 days, we seem to have lost that in the process. So the automatic ad bots that you were discussing, certainly, you know, we see a number of people coming in, but you know, maybe only 25% of those people have got the complex homelessness issues and things like that. So I'm wondering, especially with the private sector, did Emily think that the local authority were working close with her and the tenants and the landlords? We all talk about supporting the tenants, especially with mental health and multiple issues, but quite often it's the individual landlords and working with them that is the pivotal thing. The agents differ. Some agents just take a managing fee and don't really get involved. Other agents are very proactive and should be applauded, obviously. But just to go back and to recap, are you getting much help through the Homeless Reduction Act and personal housing plans that are being shared with your tenants?
I think.
Sorry, John, I should have quickly said, sorry, Emily, can you just say where you're from? I should have said that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm freelance at the moment, but I've been 13 years in local authority, housing advice, HHSRS, homeless reduction, private sector, it goes on and on and on. But yeah, predominantly local authority background, but housing associations. And before that, I was in the private sector as well as managing social housing. So I've gone right across the board with all different types. Predominantly the people with the most need really should be getting the social housing, but it's not as easy as that, is it?
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think we're in quite a privileged position in Pobl Letting Agency because we're part of the Pobl Group. So whilst we run a private sector letting agency, we also get to benefit from the wealth of knowledge and the partnership that the group has with local authority. So I think we're in a position where we can signpost and we can support our tenants. I would say that within the private sector generally, that maybe those links are not there quite so much, and that there is more that could be done, because I think even sort of colleagues that I've worked with in the past in the private rented sector don't necessarily know what is available and what options are there to help and support tenants.
Could I just say that quite often landlords can be hesitant to contact the local authority because they generally feel that the local authority is just going to be on the side of the tenant, and that is a big hurdle. Improving the communication from the local authority and the way they approach landlords to mediate and prevent are the skills that I see are sometimes lacking on frontline services. Thank you.
Thank you both of you. That was really great. Jane's got her hand up, so I think she also wants to come in on this point.
If I could please, yeah, thanks Emily, thank you John. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that were just said then, and I'm not sure if this will be helpful for you. You just made a very good point there, John, about the support for landlords, and I'm part of a private rented sector officers forum, which has representatives of all local authorities across Wales, and that's one of the things that they are going to work on now, is developing the relationships with private rented sector landlords, because that's really important. We've spoken about tenants, and you're right, there's an awful lot of support there for tenants, but it's also a case of working with landlords and building up those relationships as well, because in those, in that way we can actually then get landlords to try and help to home people that maybe have got some complex needs. So there's a lot of work going on there at the moment. You mentioned mediation, and I'm very keen to work on that. That's one of the areas I'll be looking at this year as part of the work on discrimination as well. We've seen that UK government have brought in some laws now for some of the court cases that are taking place for evictions. So they've put some contracts in place for mediation, and that goes across England and Wales. But for me, that's too late. That's when we've got people that are at the process of being evicted, and we need to think up front. So prevention's better than cure. So I'm at the moment looking at what's going on across Wales with regard to mediation, and looking at how we can possibly help and support in that area as well. So hopefully that will help with some of the things that you've mentioned. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Jane. That's really helpful coming back on that. Exactly. Thank you. We've also had a comment in, which I think is really interesting reflection from Genevieve. If you'd be okay to put your microphone on.
Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Genevieve. I'm a team leader at Brent Council in our homelessness service. And yeah, it was just a general comment really. I think it's a really interesting discussion. And I do think as a frontline service, naturally, we will always have the tenants' interests at heart. That's the way it has to work. But I absolutely feel like landlords have definitely drawn the short straw over the last year and a half. And that was really reflected in everything that Emily was saying. Sometimes it's quite a difficult balance, I think, working in frontline. You want to be able to work closely with landlords, get the best outcomes. And I think sometimes our hands are tied financially with funding and what we can do, and that the line has to be drawn somewhere. And obviously in extreme cases with thousands and thousands of pounds of rent arrears, we're quite restricted in what we can do.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting hearing that coming from over in the London example. That I've got Jennifer's hand up. So do you want to add it?
Hello, hi. I thought I'd just come in on that point as well. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting in the case study that I talked about, which was the housing sustainment service based in Scotland. And I talked about the time that was dedicated to partnership working, and actually working with local landlord organisations was a key priority for that particular service. And they also supported landlords by offering mediation where appropriate, by connecting them to support that was available. Like as was mentioned, landlords often don't know what support is available. So for example, the funding that was available locally to upgrade their windows and heating systems, for example. And the majority of referrals that service now receives is actually from private landlords. So You know, we know that many landlords do have an interest in those tenancies that are in sustaining the tenancies. So I think that, you know, drawing in landlords as a partner within advice and support services that are being developed for tenants, you know, is an important point. And then just to add to that, I think in our wider research program, one sort of theme that we're developing and that we're talking a lot about again is that advice and information and support that is available for landlords. And we just think that that's something that does need to be improved across the UK as a part of improving conditions and outcomes in the private rented sector. And actually, we would like to see it at cash as a bigger part of the kind of regulatory architecture, so to speak, of the sector, that local authorities do adopt a range of tools, you know, to address conditions and standards. Part of that is advice and support and information for landlords. But in order for local authorities to do that, we do need to be really increasing the capacities of local authorities. You know, local authorities, as been mentioned, you know, who are already under so much strain. So it's like an additional ask. So sort of appropriate resource allocations do need to be made. So I'll just stop talking there.
No, absolutely. I think it's really interesting that it does often come back to that kind of capacity within the local authorities to have that on the ground support to keep people staying in their homes. And it's that kind of circular discussion, isn't it? Jane's got her hand up. So Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. You're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. You know, local authorities are under an awful lot of pressure at the moment. And, you know, whatever we can do to try and help them, obviously we will. I think, you know, that's why it's good then feeding some of the information through and listening to some of the cases that we've heard today is really important, because it helps us when we're thinking of our policy developments. And I would say we are in a very fortunate place in Wales, because we have got Rent Smart Wales that works, you know, on behalf of all local authorities. You know, they do represent everyone, and all the organisations that, you know, represent landlords, agents and tenants obviously have regular meetings with Rent Smart Wales. So we're able to listen to some of the issues that come up, and that helps to inform some of our policy thinking. So I think that's really important. I think with Rent Smart Wales as well, we've got a really good avenue to communicate things through Rent Smart Wales. So, you know, you mentioned trying to find out where the support's available. That's something that, you know, we're doing with Rent Smart Wales, working closely with them. I know recently they just developed the tenant pages on their website, which helps to signpost people to, you know, the right help and support that's needed. And obviously they communicate very closely with landlords and agents. And at the drop of a hat, I know during the pandemic, we've had to change laws very rapidly. And Rent Smart Wales have supported us to get that key messaging out the door very quickly, so that everybody's you know, aware of the changes that we're making in Welsh Government. So, you know, that's a really good vehicle for us to get some of our messaging across.
Thank you, Jane. That's really interesting. And actually, if I could just stick with you on Rent Smart Wales for a minute, I suppose it'd be interesting to see how, with the development of the Minister for Climate Change and that kind of real drive in Wales to get that as one of our key kind of driving issues, how do you see Rent Smart Wales playing a role in that? And is there lessons we can learn from this recent experience with how we're trying to kind of tackle the next big issue?
Right, so we're talking about climate change now. So
well, climate change, yeah, and any other things that may come
absolutely along. Yeah, well, that's very high up on the agenda, isn't it? Is climate change, and with our minister now covering that as well. I mean, she's very passionate about that as well. There's lots of things that she's very passionate about, and it's some of the stuff that we'll be driving forward during this next government term. Climate change being one of them, and I know there's been consultations taking place with our counterparts in UK government with regard to the EPC ratings on properties. So that's something they're looking to push, obviously, properties up to make sure that they're of an appropriate standard. And that will help with everything. But again, it's looking at that now. We're considering that within Welsh Government and how we can support, you know, individuals to do that. I know when the laws changed and property ratings had to go from F and G ratings up to E, Rent Smart Wales did a huge piece of work, which involved, you know, trying to identify those properties across Wales, and then, you know, working closely with local authorities and communicating with landlords and agents to sort of explain, you know, the different sorts of grants and things that are available to help people to get their properties up to a certain standard. So they're definitely a vehicle to help to support landlords and agents with those sorts of things, you know, when it comes to climate change and improving property standards.
Thanks, Jane. That's really interesting. It'd be interesting to hear reflections from Jennifer and Emily as well about that kind of issue, whether it's climate change or generally how we support landlords ahead of the changes in policy coming in, and how and tenants as well, really, because I think what you've both kind of reflected on is that some of the channels that we use don't always work and don't have the long-term desired effect. So Emily, you were talking about landlords selling up. That wasn't ever the desired effect. It's, you know, an outcome that's happened. Is there a way that we can be improving those channels as we're kind of gearing up to make sure that we're all having the conversation about the changes that need to happen, and it is not happening over here and then over here, but not in the middle as well? So it'd be great to hear from both of you about that, please.
I think that it's a really difficult balance, because I think that I think as Black Pobble, we're really massively in support of the carbon neutral, and you know, we've got huge ambitions ourselves. And I agree properties need to be safe, and I think raising the standard on the EPC is sort of tied in with that as well. But it's ensuring that there is enough support, that it isn't just, it's kind of not just the stick, there's the carrot as well, I suppose, that the funding is available to landlords, that they're not just being imposed with sort of a whole heap of legislation all at once, which then they're looking at their balances, their bank balances, and thinking, actually, I can't do this. So yeah, and I think agents as well. I think letting agents are part of the key, because I think that, you know, we work with Welsh Government closely, we work with local authorities closely because of being in the position of working for a housing group where we've social housing as well as sort of private sector. But I think a lot of letting agencies are often not included in the discussions. I know I've sat on sort of different stakeholder groups, and there's been Shelter have been there, and the Residential Landlords Association have been there, but there's been nobody other than that really from on the ground running and working in letting agencies. So I think that could be a bit of a key as well.
Hello, hi. So one of the next projects that I'm working on is around energy efficiency. So I wouldn't want to kind of predict what the results of that study will be. It will be sort of a policy and practice focused report coming out in the autumn. But one of the sort of main things we'll be looking at is around sort of landlord compliance and issues of landlords' motivation, and what can the existing evidence tell us about how we can sort of encourage or incentivize landlords to take part in sort of schemes. And I think one important point to mention, you know, here to mention is that the sector, as we all know, is not homogenous. So when we're thinking about landlord behaviour and motivation, we really need to start thinking about, you know, what typologies of different landlords are out there that can help us to understand people's behaviours and responses to the new requirements, and how can that allow us to target policy initiatives more effectively. And I think the point that Emily made about letting agents is a key one, like what's the role within all of this, because the success of a particular policy initiative will vary depending on which actor you're engaging with. So that's something we'll be thinking about as well within that study.
Thanks, that was really helpful from both of you, and I think it's just so important that we keep having these discussions and don't kind of think, well, that's all behind us and we can move on now, but we're actually thinking about what's coming next. What can we learn from what we've just, you know, been through experience, what's gone well, what could be improved? And you know, we're very, you know, thankful to all three of you for coming along and sharing those kind of experiences. I haven't had any more questions come in on the chat. So it just leaves me to, if either of the three of you have got any last reflections you wanted to share, or you're happy to kind of, right, great, thank you very much. It's been a really useful event. I've learned a huge amount. I hope everybody listening has as well. Do stay in touch. We'd love to hear more from those of you who have attended about your reflections on this event and your own experiences of supporting the private rented sector and housing more generally. I'll leaves it to me to say I hope you will have a lovely afternoon and you have some sunshine today. Okay, and thank you very much. Goodbye.